Hello everyone, today we talk about Dacian infantry. The first time we talk about the Dacians, specifically just 1 month ago we were talking about post-Roman Dacia, the origins of the Romanian people, etc. And it pretty randomly happened to, have to be talking about them now. I've always been interested and curious about Dacian warfare because, according to me, it's somewhat overlooked and at the same time poorly documented. And we gotta give that, especially talking about Dacian infantry, we fundamentally cover great part of known Dacian warfare, which may not be the entirety of the story. And we have to be, open-minded but also realistic about this. As always, as a double threat. There is, in fact, a lot of mythology about certain aspects of Dacian warfare that may be also in relation with Roman arms and armor that we should look a little bit at now. That we will probably analyze at some point while discussing Dacian warfare altogether. Right, which we will do in a separate video, and surely we will come up with something else about properly, the Dacian Wars, and we will, for the Roman history manuals, and we will look at certain aspects broadly meant, also about the political and strategical background, right? Because today we discuss fundamentally arms and armor, right? What's the typical Dacian infantryman about, and or what kind of typologies we can spot, etc. That there are interesting archaeological sources, but the main ones are fundamentally the Roman iconographic ones of the Trajan column and the Tropaium Traian, in fact, that are actually, not just well-known sources, but, deservedly so, right? There is a bit this kind of ethno-nationalistic resurgency for which, those damn Romans, they misrepresented those. Well, thank the Romans in the first place, because if we had to be waiting for those peoples, we would have not had much in the first place. And still, it's important to, of course, read the sources in an accurate and, as we were saying before, cum grano salis, to add a bit more to the Latin triggering factor here. But I'm joking, of course. But I do know, because I'm actually glad that to see by a certain standard a renewed interest in these people's history, as from a serious standpoint, right? There are lots of historians, reenactors too, that are fascinated legitimately with this. Everything is fine as long as it doesn't take some kind of identitaristic path that frankly is quite ridiculous by 2021 from both sides of the aisles, right? Who are the Romans, who are the Dacians, right? And frankly, how does that matter today? And it does matter as much as we in fact realize how we can put that in inadequate historical perspective, right? Which surely makes things way less categorical and stereotypical for an intelligent conversation. There would be really a lot to say about this world picture, because essentially, going back to the aforementioned topic is, who are these peoples? Like, we can't digress today on the ethnogenesis of the Dacians or, their intersections, where they are normally considered as part properly of the Trajan, branch, let's say, and of Indo-European peoples, but with important intersections also with Celts, with Scythians, Sarmatians, Germans at some point as well. And today we discuss Dacian infantry mostly. As far as we can understand, of course, we are best documented about the Dacians altogether relatively to the early say end of the first and beginning of the second century wars with Rome. But there is also a can't say prehistory proper, but a history of previous times that is interesting to observe. There's a lot to say about the Thracians themselves, about the broader Balkan and the Asia Minor connection that these peoples had. If we think about the Phrygians, even iconically the Phrygian cap that was also becoming a helmet in shape, let's say, aesthetically, but also functionally, among the same Dacians in a bit of a stereotypical way, in the way we think the Dacians were. But we have to also understand properly that when we talk, the question could get down to this: was there any, essential difference between Dacian warfare and the one of any other essentially Central European people? The answer simply is no, right? And that's another thing that is difficult sometimes to properly put on the fore, because there is a bit of, category, say, stereotypical wargamism, saying about, that people fought in that way, that other, because they had those kind of weapons, those guys had others. We're talking about the first millennium, Andy. What kind of differences do you presume that existed from a in material culture, from a tactical point of view between Europeans altogether, right? If you look at Rome itself, especially at this time, where surely its waves had reached very far in depth into Western Eurasia, like the question is, they weren't so even different as we imagine from in terms of properly from a material standpoint. We often like to portray the fact that the Romans had legionnaires that were covered in iron from head to toe, and that fundamentally, that gave some such tremendous edge. Well, unfortunately, most of the Roman army was actually made up by non-Romans that fought essentially in very similar ways. In the first place, to the average of the other peoples they fought against, the Romans had this armored elite. They had more than else a professional standing army. That means a collective training that these peoples could only dream of, and that is what factually makes the difference in quality in the whole history of mankind, right, in war. This doesn't mean, however, that the Dacians, as any other people, didn't have their own armored elite, for example, which is a bit of a bias. That is, we know about that, actually, that they had, right? But just for some stereotypization in there, coming from a misreading of the same Roman sources, you're going to think that prevalently, these guys were just without armor, because that's how they appeared on Trajan column, etc., in the Roman monuments. In part, this is true also for troops that fought in Roman service. We don't have to think that this applies as a standard armored and unarmored type of warfare. Armies were much more similar than we think. Dacia had a very interesting background in terms of wealth, of proto-urbanization, right? Some people want to say that this was a nascent civilization of some sort. Factually, it wasn't very different from what we think, just the maybe at best we can conceive as a continuation of the same standards that we can find, for example, in the richest Celtic areas, so mostly the southern ones, that were more exposed to Mediterranean traffics. That were, they had milder climate, more demographic, economical strength, right? But even in this, they didn't take much of a step forward. The Romans were fundamentally interested in that has already subdued areas that were, of course, more advanced than others, right? And that's basically the criterion that the Romans were looking at, fundamentally maintaining locally a satisfactory, political control in costs-benefits ratio, but hell, the Romans kept even Britain, so, you can't, it's the fact that they invaded Dacia by itself, also considering importantly, the richest, iron, copper, might, but also silver, importantly a lot. This was functional to Trajan's policy of, revaluation of the denarius to favor the middle classes against the oligarchy, the luxury of the senatorial aristocracy. And just the Romans were. They had always been interested in Dacia. As you know, Caesar would have preferably actually wanted to invade Dacia. We would have had a Commentari de Bello Dacico if he had received the prefectorate of the Illyricum, things went otherwise. But let's say the Romans were fundamentally content just with controlling these people also at distance, right? This idea of the properly, military occupation as a criterion of domination is fundamentally a 19th century nationalist, statalist misconception of how, pre-industrial powers managed to extend their territory, right? The Romans controlled much beyond what we conceive as their frontier, and Dacia being kind of no exception, so that when attritions arrived, which had always existed because these peoples were fundamentally unstable by themselves, and it would take some chances to raid into more productive territories such as Moesia in just south between essentially the Danube Valley south of the Carpathians, where the Dacians were within which the Dacians were settled. Well, this would lead to Romans never forgetting fences and basically first taming them, then eventually occupying them, and with the absolutely average degree of radical violence in terms of enslavement and extermination that was proper of any single people, Dacians included, by any ancient moral standard, right? The history, actually, the Dacians wars is very fascinating. Also, it's properly Romanian history in general, right? Has a lot to, it's an exception a bit on its own for many reasons. We will see this probably better in our medieval history videos, as Romanian warfare in this sense of essentially Carpathian in reality, which was also composite, right? Historically speaking, the region is split in various areas that receive different cultural influences. But let's say that the Dacians were, dwelling in this basin, Carpathian basin, that fundamentally sheltered them, for which they could entrench themselves in their strongholds, protecting their mines, having, an even degree of compaction. It's a bit like Bohemia, also by geographical, also by local resources for the boy. Or there are peoples that lived a bit in this sense, and so and surrounded by also very different military cultures. In my opinion, had toughened up Dacian warfare over the centuries, right? For many reasons. Dacia was, as we've seen, was fairly rich for Central European standards. It was well connected historically since an early age to, for example, the Greek markets. The Dacian elites had fundamentally always imported arms and armor from places like Macedon. They had always observed, because it was just next door in the Balkans, right, down southwards, what was happening in this, much more dynamic and advanced realities. They had access, importantly, to the Hellenic markets of the Black Sea coast. That also played a very important role. They were exposed to the Iranian peoples of the Eurasian steppes that brought a big deal of military culture at waves into Europe. I mean, even, think about Celtic metallurgy is fundamentally a Scythian borrowing, you can say, at least in Proto-Indo-European times. That was the direction. Also, there was an important, in fact, Celtic influence all over the Danube that is often overlooked, that arrived straight up to Thrace fundamentally, and the Dacians also had to, to contend sometimes the control of the frontier areas with pretty warlike peoples such as the Skordiski, right, the Pannonians. And lately also with the Germans, that at this point had, started creating problem on the Danubian frontier of the Roman Empire, and fundamentally were next door, right? Dacia is not just a Carpathian basin, right? Say better, yeah. I mean, it's wherever Dacians are. And some you can find in up to today's Ukraine, southern Poland, Slovakia, eastern Serbia, northern Bulgaria. So it's not just more stereotypically Romania altogether, but surely the center there existed. It was, as we've seen, a solidly built one. So indeed, this military culture had somewhat a unique character, right? I'm very much actually for pointing out that yes, given the European average, Central European average, these peoples probably were slightly more, they differed more. They had a higher degree of diversification. I think most of it actually came from the Eastern influence, right? Rather than, I don't know, the Celtic one, the Western one, or even the Northern one, as fundamentally the Carpathians shield from the steppes that basically from the Pannonian plains go down the Danube, then they proceed into Transnistria in the north. They open eventually into today's Ukraine. And this long corridor is also very overlooked historically in terms of especially of shifting literally passage, exchange of military cultures, technologies, and so on. Because of it was fundamentally it was an object of constant, trouble, right, for whoever. Peoples like the Sarmatians notoriously also, past the Carpathians north and fundamentally fitted into this area that stands between the Danube and the Carpathians, the Western Carpathians. There was a long stripe that basically, the Romans conquered Dacia for also to kind of pressure and to, surround from Pannonia and Dacia at the same time. So strong, actually, equestrian military cultures. If you look at the neighboring Thrace, at the same time, you see that basically those tribes living on the left, that is northern bank of the Danube, were actually mounted, whereas southern Thracians they had also mostly infantry, right? And it's difficult sometimes to even, in fact, draw a generalistic picture of these populations. And my idea is that the Dacian military culture acted a bit as the anvil against this Iranian hammer coming from the east. And from one side, toughening up its own infantry, mostly for strategical, tactical reasons. Political, social, primarily, but the Dacians were overwhelmingly sedentary, right? There were surely tribes that were semi-nomadic around because of migration movements, etc. But fundamentally, we are looking at a sedentary people. They were mostly about infantry, and therefore they would more likely develop a response also to the horsemen of the steppes that is similar to what historically would happen later on also with the Slavs, right? You have this sturdy, determined infantry is capable essentially of taking a lot of arrows, etc., but maintaining its compactness for, eventually those nomads to charge, having hoping to have softened it up and resolving the thing. There weren't dramatic asymmetries in terms of properly in combat effectiveness between these peoples. Right, as we were saying before, civilizations like the Roman one that had been also in previous times, the Macedonian, etc., had maintained a quality standard, right, that was unknown to these peoples. But at the same time, we know that warfare, at the end of the day, is essentially all about leveling this asymmetry, and Iron Age peoples didn't dramatically differ in terms of a military system can be superior, but can also be defeated. Often, right, the same Dacian wars actually show that with the Romans that suffered their share of defeats, and there is nothing about that can make you say, okay, well then, that's like a football match, just count it and determine what is the... No. There are some objective standpoints which, given the certain levels of political and social military realities, you have, in fact, on the field something different. And that's why the Dacians also resorted in this mountainous territory, most for rest, etc., into something more, what would think of stereotypically barbarian, right, as, hit and run tactics and strategies, etc. But of course, being able to field what is, in fact, not usually the typical barbarian stereotype, actually, solid infantries. Right, Central European peoples had always been pretty tough. From that point of view, the Romans had definitely to sweat, and cry to get rid of them. Some of the most overwhelming military force from Rome was exactly on the Danube. Right, think about in Augustan times how the properly the Danubian era was secured. It involved the deployment of tens of imperial Roman legions. The Saint Dacians showed this capability of striking back even after defeat and still being aggressive-minded in a way. So we leave this partially away. The question is that doesn't matter, however, how much these differences could be important by those time standards. Still, in practice, we are still looking at small things floating on an overwhelmingly solid base of essentially shared standards. So by Central European standards, no, we can say the Dacians, stand out for something particularly different. But there are still some characteristics that we can point out from especially their equipment, which is mostly what we get also as information, etc., about the warfare of these peoples. The most depicted ones are the large, richly decorated oval shields. Like if you had to, let's start off by saying that the average Dacian warrior, in fact, was basically virtually identical to the average ancient warrior type of any kind in any people in any continent. That is basically a guy with a shield, with a medium sized shield, javelins / spears, and some kind of secondary weapon like a sword, etc. That's the standard of the whole ancient warfare. Like, you can't move away from this thinking that but that people was different. Senatorily wise, unless in fact we're not talking about properly nomadic peoples, all peoples fought like that. Right, the Germans fought like that, the Celts fought like that, the Italics fought like that, the Iberians fought like that. It was the Libyans fought like everybody. The Iranians, the Persians fought like that. It was the same identical thing. So any kind of categorical distinction at that point to say, no, that's different, no, it's nonsense. Here we stay also at representations, as we were saying before. Essentially, the Romans made of the Dacians themselves. So from a certain standard, there is a bias there, right? The Romans were celebrating, glorifying their own accomplishments in Dacian. They were fundamentally portraying the Dacian, right, as it would ethnographically remain, also with some classicistic mark. For example, the Goth later on would become kind of similar, not just because the Goths eventually settled in Dacian. They literally adopted some kind of local clothing and characteristic gear, etc. But properly because these were the barbarians, right? The Romans were standardizing the idea at this point with a renewed pressure, as it would increase later on in the 2nd century from the north, as those central northern European peoples that fundamentally looked all the same, and that were stereotypically that thing, right? But also they were actually quite similar fundamentally. On Roman reliefs, those oval shields are uniform, basically in shape and style of decoration. You know that the same Romans depicted in there are fundamentally something very similar. It's very easy to see, even from the same Roman monuments, how there is, in spite of this uniformity, there is not properly anything like, something like a unique type of soldier, a unique type of equipment, of armament, of arms. There is nothing. They always bear it. Right, but there is kind of repetition of such models, and there are exceptions. For example, for the same Dacian shields that are, for example, covered in scale pattern at some point. There is also an unusual Dacian design to be found on an oval shield carried by a man in Dacian costume on another Traianic relief that was moved eventually to the Ark of Constantine. If you've ever seen, there are those beautiful Dacians on the Ark of Constantine that were later literally moved from there. And this design basically has 4 monster-headed trumpets radiating from the central boss, and 2 Celtic type, but I don't presume it's even proper, actually, torque of twisted metal. Right, which together with the monster trumpets shown in groups all over the pedestal of the of Trajan's column, where mostly armor is shown, and people say, oh, you see, there are torques, right? Probably, I don't know whether these type of torques have been analyzed. Probably, of course, everything is being analyzed from those sides are specifically particularly similar to the Celtic ones, but torques, as we've seen everywhere, were used even here, every freaking where. The torque is not a Celtic thing only. It's a largely like you find it everywhere. The Iranians had them. Even the Parthians had them. The Romans had it. Basically the same. The Vedics had them. It's the idea of the ring. The Germans had them, by the way, of the ring that fundamentally encloses you and possesses you with its magic, so that you become possessed by the divinity of war. All the symbolism behind it's a universal language. So to say, well, these look like Celts because the Celts were near, yeah, surely there was some influence, there's no doubt, right? But a Dacian would have believed that in spite of the Celts, right? It was a universal religious military belief that was essentially the exclusive moral base on which any people in ancient history reasoned like. So yeah, it's interesting. Naturally, this is a Roman creation of the figure, so they knew better, definitely. But we are certain that the Dacians had the same identical thing. By the way, we didn't say that. We'll see it probably with an hypothesis I have relatively to the Dacian arms. That are kind of the more iconographic and famous thing, is that the Dacians were animated also by a very deep and almost fanatic, but priestly based religion, right? That gravitated around the temple of Sarmizegetusa. That was mostly a nobility thing, and that surely was connected with kingship, etc. Today we can't digress in there, but this thing is very important for two orders of reasons. The first one, of course, is the moral force you have to imagine behind these peoples in general, and why for them, what kind of motivations could bring them. But in parallel, also with the obvious political and social reflection, that mostly tells us about an aristocratic society, right? I don't have many terms of comparison here, but as far as I understand, Dacian society was somewhat more stratified than the one of the surrounding peoples in general, at least, properly in Central Europe, because of their wealth, because of the Dacian aristocracy that had always maintained this, important international context, was rich, had monopolized by a certain degree the local mineral resources, right? So this could explain actually a lot of things, also relatively to the, how cohesive was this people at the end of the day. That fundamentally, the stronger the middle classes normally, and the stronger properly from in terms of wealth and capacity of armament, etc., and normally the more resistant peoples are. The Dacians were kind of a pain behind for the Romans, because they kind of were this, at the end of looming threat in these rich Danubian areas that the Romans had seized control of, and they were entrenched into the Carpathians. So it was either you conquered all Dacia as Trajan did, otherwise there was not much other way to get rid of the problem. It's difficult properly to compare how cohesive these peoples could be. I don't know, for what had been, the Belgians, for example, 1 century and a half before, compared to, for example, the more kind of feudal Gallic society, where just were the rich guys at the top, and the rest of freemen were not even freemen technically anymore, were just serfs, and in fact their infantry had sunk in quality compared to the ones of more cohesive people like the Germanic ones, etc. So this is something that would probably have to come back at some point, but still reveals at the end of the day why the Dacians weren't at the end of the day a real major threat to the Romans, right? Okay, they scored some regional, some military success on a regional scale, but at the end of the day, in 2 campaigns they were done for, right? And Dacia was occupied. Basically the Dacians and there as properly as a people, politically speaking, right, and not ethnically, because the continuity remained, but meaning what's the degree of a resurgence of these phenomena? Not much, actually. Right, aside from guerrilla in the mountains, etc., where it's completely normal for these things to happen, even in much more, think about how much the Romans took to properly secure the Alps, right? That ended up into Nero's time, fundamentally, after Rome had conquered the World War. But also we have, exactly for that reason, to say, evidently, such threats were not that important, right, if they lasted so long. So I don't want to overstate Dacian military potential, but here we're talking about, simply consider what it is. It's just basically the Carpathian basins, right? Plus some allies. Yes, even the Roxolani, the Romans defeated part of the Sarmatians also in the process of the Dacian wars. How many Dacians do you want that they inhabited there, right? Well, what do you think was the broader demographic, manpower, wealth, concentration, like, functionalized for properly expansional capabilities compared to other threats the Romans had met, like, I don't know, the Celtiberians or the Gauls, or that's debatable. Consider also that, and this is rightly pointed out by historiography enough, I would say, that how much by a time like the 2nd century AD, whoever had lived at that point in the Roman frontier was fundamentally heavily influenced by Rome itself. As it had been the case, we've seen, especially for the Dacians, with the Hellenistic military culture that had always had an important connection with, from Macedon, Thrace, etc., with Dacia, in fact, so that we're looking at peoples that were already taking like the next step. It's a bit like the Germans, especially from the times of the Marcomannic Wars, but properly the idea of the creation of some confederacies, of some kind of more, extended and cohesive groupings of peoples that could pose a more consistent threat, right? So with the aforementioned exceptions, Dacian shields, as shown in the carvings, are also aesthetically decorated with floriate, braided, geometric, planetary designs. So pretty much also similar to what you could see in the same Roman armies, etc. There is some evidence of also Thracian influence. For example, the Thracian shield known as pelton, right? And is used normally in a distorted form in these representations. We would say that Dacian shields are very large in this Roman art. We don't know whether it's a poetical license, but it could be actually realistic, and it may have to do with what we see, generally speaking, in let's say in those areas, also for in medieval warfare, for especially in early Middle Ages. But not only, actually, in the areas, in the frontier areas with between the sedentary peoples and the steppes, that is to say, the developing of larger shields and specific forms to offer greater protection. Think about the quadrangular Slavic design that is to be found basically all over, from Russia to Bulgaria, etc. In this crescent that borders the steppe, that is very likely designed to properly achieve a greater protection. So it is possible that the Dacians may have had some larger shields than, I don't know, the Germans, than the Celts. I think it's just I think it's realistic as an hypothesis, it's plausible. And these shields also appear to be flat. Which is very fascinating because that flat shields are normally they're best to create properly what is called the shield wall, right? That is contrarily to what is commonly believed. It's not actually a great deal of it doesn't speak much for the qualitative individuality of the single men that make the shield wall, but actually with a more functionalized collective, and therefore potentially also more effective, in fact, screening capacity. Why? Because you can flat shields can form properly, can be overlapped with each other without particular problem. You see, the Romans at this time had typically the at least the legionnaires, stereotypically as we think, had the quadrangular shield, right? Especially in Trajanic times, it's the most. We don't even know it was actually prevalent among the same legionnaires, but that is concave, right? And it speaks for the still for the individuality that the Roman miles retain, in spite of its dramatic collective training, even in single combat, because the idea was that more or less the Roman legionnaire was still an hybrid between properly a specialized individual warrior and still capable of fighting preferentially and more functionally and more productively, of course, into a formation. I say it because it's normally overlooked. And the idea of these large shields, that are also flat or can provide this imposant screen to missile, right, could actually add to the steps reaction hypothesis. Hypothesis that is properly, this was, the Dacians were used to maybe present this, like maybe basically all actually the Central European peoples, this solid frontal lines, right? The myth that the barbarians fought like, in scatter formation without order is in fact a myth, right? They all knew pretty well, like, basically any formation since, I don't know, the people, the sea people's times onwards, this solid front and solid capacity, that is also what these barbarians fundamentally enacted because of leading the initial charge, right, to remain cohesed frontally, because they put most of their effort in the first and basically only charge at some point, normally in a single line, to properly deliver this mass, shock force that was what they were could say functionalized for, because normally having less of logistical supplying systems, they couldn't stay long on the field, so they differently from other military civilizations that relied more effectively on reserves in a more systematic way, such as the same Romans. They had to stay as short as possible on the field, properly for political reasons, right? Because it was that these were not centralized realities, so it was already a big deal to bring all these peoples on the field, and they couldn't stay for long. So it was either the big shock charge to break, or all home, right? And this is normal in military history at this point. It's kind of it, but this doesn't mean that they didn't know how to make that effectively, actually. And we know how hard the Dacian campaigns were for the Romans, in fact. And this would be actually the standard type, and naturally, a front line of this type is not quite fitting the stereotype, as we will see, of Dacians more or less all armed with this kind of Sekai, with the Sika, the Falks, the Ronfai, etc. That might have been confined to not necessarily elite troops, but to also certain conditions of combat that would have been good in an ambush, for example, rather than in a front line where you mostly have to operate with spear and shield. That is still the most effective equipment in terms of cost-benefit ratio altogether, especially in a pitched battle, right, in a large scale formation. And so the shield bosses are hemispherical, with round boss plates, both being decorated, which suggests probably there was some degree of offensivity to them, right? As you punch a person in the face, you blow his teeth out with a boss, a bit like the Roman bosses at this point, actually. Some have suggested that the Thracian lunate shield motive might have been a specific type, but you see, the Romans had them frequently. Other peoples, in fact, had them. So it might have been something more specifically Dacian. Who knows? At least the Romans represented them like this, but that's all we know. Speaking of helmets, well, there are fundamentally two categories. One is a neat, rounded, cone-shaped shell. Right, so the simpler one fundamentally, for some kind of moderate but still good protection fundamentally. The other one with its apex curved forward into the characteristic Phrygian peak, right? Phrygian caps were used in the area by the Dacians, had been used by, in fact, by the Thracian Phrygians, for which they took the name from. It was pretty, widespread in especially in this eastern areas of the, Balkans, Black Sea, Asia Minor, etc. I think about even Mithras had this. So it was a fashion that spread in Hellenistic times, far and wide, but it was also probably older, if I remember correctly. It was typical of, also of the Dacians too, so much that the Goths appear eventually wearing these caps when they reached the Carpathians too. It might have been actually a local inheritance, let's say, in fashion. This we're talking about an actual helmet, right? So there was, in the structure, it was surely some kind of, the defensive functionality to it. Both these types of helmets are highly decorated, which also added in some, greater strength to the structure altogether. The decoration of one of the solid crests runs over one of these helmets, together with the close general resemblance to the Phrygian cap as we've seen in art, right? And there is an obvious connection with them that might have been specific to the Dacians. There were surely Thracian helmets too, but Dacians seemingly were at least, probably the most portrayed like this, I guess, properly in helmets. And seemingly there is no Iranian influence, in spite of the intersections that we will see in a while, properly with the Sarmatians, because the same Roman reliefs that show the Scytho-Sarmatian troops that fought alongside the Dacians, but also the same Romans, show the typical conic helmet of composite construction, a bit the one that would evolve into the forms of the Spangenhelm later on, right? Yeah. There are some florid decorations also for the Phrygian helmets and whatever, but surely these were used also by other peoples. Remember that the Balkans had interesting helmets that sometimes are that are very similar actually to the ones used in the Near East, in the Middle East as well, but in the Sarmatian steppes, etc. And sometimes we were talking about that, for example, in that video about the Roman auxiliary archers of the Imperial Age, like what we usually call as, the Syrian/Levantine archers with that specific conic composite helmet type might have not actually been the typical Syrian, as we called it, but they might have been actually derived from Balkan designs, right? And that were, however, surely also shared, or however similar with the ones of the surrounding regions, for that matter. Speaking of armor, body armor specifically, there are three varieties. They're a bit normal at the time: mail, leaf scale, and banded construction. The latter might have been of Iranian influence, right? The Romans were not the only ones that used banded armor at this point. The same goes for the Manichae, that, people say, the Romans had this special thing, it came from gladiatorial time. No, it was Hellenistic armors seen in the Pergamon altar, for example, but, even there are much older examples properly of such designs, right? There wasn't much there to invent because some genius woke up and found a new type of armor. They were also all pretty similar, right? Telling the truth, there is not even a clear factual demonstration that this so-called banded Roman segmented armor actually was this dramatic addition of protection compared even to a coat of mail, right? We must get used to think that even materials, etc., everything was all coming in all various forms according to a cost-benefit ratio that was not based on, even properly for the functionality of combat on these criteria, as we understand, right? Surely the Dacians show some degree of Eastern influence as well in their equipment. And by the way, this is probably the topic you were waiting for at some point, but we will have to wait maybe for you to start now talking about the weapons. That did the Romans actually adopt certain type of reinforced armor because they had to fight the Dacians? No. Right, or better, there is no way to know that on the base of our, evidence, our information. Right, that is a mechanistic deduction that finds no actual demonstration. It's an hypothesis at best, if not to say speculation. You say, no, because the Falks, their fire were so terrific, the Romans had to. There is no proof of that. Right, for the simple reason that we have no idea how spread all these arms and armor actually were, right? And it's not because a famous iconographic source tells us that look, those guys are heavier equipped, etc. It's because that campaign, because it happened like that. No, it's not what actually happened. We don't know what actually happened. These are just essentially artistic. Like if you look at a Trajan column, it's a propaganda work. Right, if you look even at provincial monuments and archaeology especially, they tell us a different story, which is not a worse story, but it's actually the real one and usually the best suited one, and it tells us that fundamentally there was such a degree of shared material culture, and simply our information is so fragmentary and scattered, and we don't even know how properly internally the Roman army was equipped, how their equipment was actually distributed among the various tactical specialties, all the units and all the stuff, that saying it happened like that, they adopted heavier armor because they had to fight the Falks, man, it's pure nonsense. Right, it doesn't find any historical evidence of any single kind, and don't come to say, no, because they found, some Roman helmets in Dacia that found extra reinforcements that we don't find everywhere that were built on campaign, because the Romans did that every freaking where. Right, when the Romans had to launch massive campaigns, they basically brought also basically the armor they could find, the extra ones they had in the various forces scattered along the empire, because that's how eventually in Dacia it happened as well. They brought it together. They also during campaign they repaired their own armor, right? Because in parts there was still some detractions at some level. Even here it's not clear, but still. There was a high degree of customization, and naturally, people wanted to be protected. They found different solutions to it. So, some examples of that, statistically speaking, are not indicative of not even a majority trend of what was happening in the Roman army or in any other army for that matter at that time. And we know so few, even how much the Dacians or other peoples used certain type of weapons, and probably we don't know about many other weapons that were also used and just we didn't find, that that there is no point to that. That is to say, you can hypothesize that and it's fine. But the question of proving it is beyond historical reach. That is, nobody knows that, but especially nobody can know it, and especially nobody will ever know it, because the degree of information we have about that time will prevent it. It's not a matter of, we'll find other 20 examples, archaeological, wise, of things like that. We do not know properly how that world was. We don't know how these weapons were distributed, made, /done, it's just approximate. The degree of uncertainty of how much these factors could vary, even when we know they were there, prevent us from knowing how the thing happened, right? And it's like with the segmentata. They said, no, because it was designed to repair, from the arrows in the east. There's no evidence of that. It was used everywhere. There is no connection of sort, and still we don't even know sometimes what kind of material these armor was made of, right? Because from reliefs, how the hell do you know, right? Some things you can see technically speaking, but others, right? And it was normal to have also this degree of diversity actually inside the equipment. Before passing to weapons that are definitely very fascinating still, let's speak briefly of Dacian costume for a while. This is easy. As we were saying before, the Dacian also became a bit of an ethno, graphical, stereotype, let's say, of the barbarian for a while, especially from the Balkan area, and whoever actually came from there, not through there, let's say, not necessarily from there, like the Goths later on. They fundamentally wore this tunics and cloaks. They're very common to be seen, on Trajan columns and among the trophies on the pedestals. Dacians, they are not showed wearing body armor helmets, right? Just we have all this massed equipment at the base of or depicted at the base of the Trajan columns that shows us like what the praise of war. We don't know to which peoples they concretely belonged, but it's also a non-problem because it's obvious that there was armor, and especially in the elite as always, and that's normal. And there is no way even in here to say that the Dacians had a less degree of armor. At least not specifically on the base of on this iconographic evidence. There might have been another reason, but I'm not even convinced for that. I would tell it mostly for the Trajans, telling the truth. We'll say it in a while when explaining why, for example, we find things like the phalanxes or the Remphaia, etc. there. The Dacian warrior tunic was normally split to the sides and the neck. It was not too baggy. For example, in the trousers were tied in at the ankle. They would have worn also short cloaks, or also longer ones. People say, they wouldn't use it in combat. Cloaks can add some minimal degree of, variability. I don't know whether it exists, the term in English, during a fight, but it's obvious that when you get heated under, whatever, let's say, actually the naked the better at some levels if you really don't have actual armor. This cloak, if it had not been left off, it would show the split neck, right? And speaking of weapons specifically, we were looking at, for example, the Celtic influence. There is definitely one weapon of Celtic Latin type that hangs from the belt on a coat of leaf armor in the Trajan column. And other swords were with planar spada-type guards and hilts that have plated belts attached to the scabbard as well. So surely there were the straight double-edged Iron Age kind of Latin derived at least type of swords in Dacian equipment. This is completely normal because Celts were all around in the south and in the west, as we've seen. So there's nothing to be surprised of. That would be kind of an average sword. Also, as we've seen, this kind of straight type was proper of the Iranian peoples as well. The Romans used spada themselves. The Germans used, right? So at that time, basically, there was a lot of similarity. Yes, the Romans had, conventionally, like this. The gladius was just one of. I've seen also the legionaries were minority in altogether, right? Cavalry used spada, etc. So there is really nothing strange or wrong to think. Properly of also Roman influence. Even though it was probably something common in Central Europe by itself already from centuries. Somewhere we talked, I don't remember where, about the dracones, right? The metallic standards in the form of a dragon head, which actually in the case of Dacians is mostly to seem like dogs/wolves, right? So much that also one of the disputed etymologies of Dacians is actually the wolves. And I think the Dacian dracones are some of the most beautiful and horrifying military ensigns. They were both ensigns and musical instrument that ever in military history. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen that. Those canines are pure evil. Right, if you look at that thing, it freezes your brain. These people naturally believed deeply into this deities. They were properly, necrophagous animals of the military deities that connected with the underworld of the dead warriors. All these things, it's a bit everywhere. It's like the Roman wolf, the Fenrir. Well, it's a common language of Indo-European cultures and beyond, and they are terrible to watch. And you have to think properly of the multisensorial experience that a battle was at the time, properly with the use of draconics as well. They were not plainly signaling things, right? Not even the Roman army had abandoned the idea that the music there was the verse of the spirit, right, of the deities, and that was a living testament of the favor of the gods, right? The Dracos spoke, right? They were played in ways that would simulate properly the roaring of the animal that was sacred to the deity in that sense. And these people were all over the ancient world, were fanatically, almost pathologically obsessed with these things, right? To them, to be possessed by these deities during what was the only thing that a freeman would have in his mind from birth to death, right? And they would kill themselves in battles in a way that the ferocity of which that fortunately, but sometimes also unfortunately, in terms of what understanding of what you can actually do as a human, we don't know anymore, right? And we constantly underestimate. And as we were saying, Dacian's Dracones, also improperly called so, are beautiful. There are also, however, the Sauri type of Dracones, also because of the Sarmatian influence, that were the Sauromata, exactly because of these dragon standards are reptiles, right? And that belong to the broader, in that case, properly to people also the steppes that were pretty skilled in metallurgy. The dragon is a bit of a closer symbol of the underworld, of the treasure of the metals of this precious thing, whereas for they had also wolves and things like that. The dwellers of the steppes, I would say, in Europe, in sedentary Europe, the wolf thing prevailed, as we can see basically in any Western European people in ancient history. And they were shared, and surely, yes, there was a Sarmatian influence as well. I mean, even the Romans would adopt properly the dragon, right? And the Dacians did, the Germans did, right? We will talk about the Dacian Draconari perhaps in a separate video, right? But still, for the sake of completeness, we can say, obviously the mouth of the animal was opened, was attached to a tubular fabric body of brilliant hue, and it functioned by blowing. And we see some other insignia, etc. Here, sometimes it's difficult to understand from which peoples they had been taken, but it's not dramatically important. Coming back to weapons, as we were saying at the beginning, spears and javelins were the standard types, right? They, by themselves, by style, don't tell much about their prominence. Hell, they're spears and javelins. How much do you want to make them differ from others? It's just like oval shields, right? As you've seen, that's the standard equipment. Standard. That is to say that the overwhelming majority of warriors uses them in actual, in combat properly, in a collective, for the sake of a tactical functionality, but especially every single soldier knows how to use them. There's no such a thing like a warrior that knows how to use arrow and fire but doesn't know how to use a sword or a javelin, or bow and arrow for that matter, which is often overlooked. We also have battle axes that are interesting because they speak sometimes the language of armor, anti-armor weapons, let's say, but more characteristics are the falxes. So there are some differences between the Sicae, the falxes, and the Rhomphaii. And it's not an easy one because there is properly nothing categorical. Like what I would like to make you understand sometime, probably most of you hopefully already know, is how much, aside from the strictly linguistical problem, that is, we have no idea what they practically, certain words practically indicated materially speaking, what kind of weapons, right? But still, archaeological evidence obviously provides us with, such a dramatically varying range of weapons, both in form and in size, etc., that there is always, it's like the question that I was asked recently, and some people keep making, that they used to say, is there a difference between a javelin and a spear? Well, technically, yes, they are usually differentiated, but at a certain point you can still use them. Like, there is still a type of spear that you can't quite distinguish from a javelin at some point, right? Or that from a practical point of view, it doesn't even make sense to think. Like, anything pointy that you can throw at people in a way or another to poke at them is can be used as such, right? This is not particularly important if not understanding, and of course here we won't talk much about fencing problems, but they were pretty standard for those times. There would be an awful lot of time spent in battle throwing javelins, because combat lasted notoriously just a few minutes. Battles lasted days, and all the rest of the time was filled essentially with skirmishes, right? The Romans did the same with their own pila at some level, right? That we don't have to think that all the pila were thrown, for example, as heavy javelins just in the functionalized way of all together during the attack in that fully synchronized ways all the time, right? Also, we don't know even how many were actually carried. Not by the single legionnaire, because that was just basically two, but specifically by, there were others, right? And the troops could be replenished during battle. The idea is that javelins can be thrown before, to soften up the enemy lines before the clash. But you can also properly, with the spear, you can do similar things. You can also break. Maybe when you want to break, you throw your spear at the enemy, you flee. You can do a lot of different things. That would be the standard Dacian warrior, as we've seen also, basically the standard ancient one. When speaking of the Sika, basically this was a sort of curved dagger that we find it also in other peoples. The Romans used in gladiatorial games, for example. There was also specific gladiatorial specialties that functioned with it. The falx is something like one hand, or sometimes 1.5 handed blade, single-edged blade, curved, most made for chopping, of course, but having this important tip that is so hook-like that, probably it was much more effective in properly piercing with that than properly cutting in front. The Rhomphaia is conceived as something similar, because some examples are curved, but fundamentally some are straight as well. Rhomphaia is something you find also in Byzantine times as a terminology for two-handed swords, and we know that, in early medieval Scandinavia, also in the south, you find similar weapons like that. The question here, so they're not unknown weapons. They may be, yes, kind of especially the latter, one of the few actual examples of, if not the only one I can think at the moment, of properly double-handed sword actually used in combat in Europe, in ancient Europe, right, in this time, at least around this time. I can think just of some Indian examples, if speaking of elsewhere. But this is not important. The important would be to provide a coherent explanation of why there is such, an important, properly, Romans depicted the Dacians being equipped very often with these kind of weapons. They were kind of iconic, also more of the Thracians, especially their own fire. And still, we have an impressive solid amount of archaeological finds proper, so we are sure that this was a common weapon, where and another. The problem is why, right? Was it concentrated in this area? That is, essentially, was the Dacian Thracian peoples scattered between the Balkans and Asia Minor? It's very difficult to answer this question in in general, because of the aforementioned reasons, that is probably we don't know how common this weapon was, whether it was specifically attached to certain kind of units, or whether it was probably also spread among, commoners in a way or another. Thinking about the sacerdotal class, the military aristocracy of the Dacians, etc., we could think that these weapons had some kind of sacred meaning. Their shapes was, as we've seen, mostly this curved, hooked. Sometimes even I don't remember having seen them, but I've seen read some studies speak about that it was even curved as a sort of S at some point, almost slightly for the form it did. So it was properly a versatile weapon that it doesn't that entails a complex fencing. So swords in general, as you know, in these realities were rare, right? Swords were normally of higher status warrior's weapon, and as such, they reflected also the warrior's possibility to train longer and more effectively for such a demanding weapon, right? Especially their Infantry was kind of a masterpiece. It's like these people had probably also to be robust, etc., because these weapons were of important also weight. That is never dramatic, but still you need some physique to handle and to be properly fit to use, etc. We know that the Dacians, the Thracians, were depicted a bit like the stereotype of Central European barbarians, tough, kind of beefy, tall, this kind of look. So their elites were probably, especially in this rough tribal realities, that in also providing this elite swordsman with all the skills and psychophysical capacities attached. At the same time, it seems that this weapon was somewhat more, it doesn't appear anywhere else around this time. The neighboring Skordisky Celts, for example, had some kind of curved weapons that probably resembled that pattern, but that altogether the Germans didn't have it, the Celts didn't have it. There are the Bastardni that some are, a bit of a mystery in the ancient people, because they were considered some of the finest, if not the finest, mercenaries in the ancient world by a certain degree. Some say they were Dacian, some say they were Celts, some say they were Germanic, some say that they were Proto-Slavic. We don't know, because also those areas to us are pretty blurred from an ethnic point of view. It's probably not even, who cares what ethnicity they were? But they were represented by the Romans in the Dacian wars because they had fought properly against them. Maybe the Romans depicted them a little bit more as if probably the Bastardni had this bias for the Falks in a certain sense, but this doesn't mean that Dacians wouldn't make use of them in the same ratio, right? So we could think once again that there was some religious status attached to the use of some swords. That's an idea I have, but this still doesn't explain why that area, right, produced that specific blade, because it can't be just an ideal thing. This might have been simply straight swords, right, or at least, well, some Romphaias we've seen were, but we're talking about the Falks. It was the most common type, raised blatantly curved, and fascinatingly, so refined as a sword. And the answer, like, altogether could be the following. As far as I understand, like, it's years that I've looked mostly at these peoples, and they're, I've grown sensitive to this kind of shades that we can mostly understand, as we've seen on this fundamentally homogeneous base, is that areas such as, especially the ones between Thrace and Dacia, the Danubian area, and some, considering also the influence that, previous dominations had, just like the Macedonian one, etc., make me think that especially south of the Carpathians, there was some kind of less militarized and I would say, more even gentrified. But I mean, they weren't dramatically developed places, telling the truth, at all. Just Mysia was rich, right? But yet there is the idea that that kind of hardcore tribal character of certain peoples, aside from the more mountainous areas of the Balkans that in fact open, that seas towards the east, towards the Black Sea, around those areas, was decreased, right? The Balkan mountains were settled by some of the most radically ferocious people that you can ever imagine. If we were mentioning before the Skordisky, for example, that are freaking mind-blowing, were these other ferocious military cultures. But let's say that it may be that, I don't know, even with the Thracians, we see after all a light equipment, after all, right? You don't find more characteristically, like in the Celtic world, for example, you know that there was a heavily armored elite, and that the majority of the warriors were much cheaper stuff, right? Especially in most Celtically advanced areas, paradoxically, the ones that pioneered more metallurgy was because they had more powerful elites at the expense of the freemen, right? So freemen were kind of crap in terms of of levies and things like that. This doesn't mean much, right? But I guess that also the presence of horses around might have been one other element there. Why? For example, so it's a combination of probably an average less armored reality in places like today's Bulgaria, roughly, which is also another statement, probably, because I'm sure that some tribal realities there didn't differ much from others of Central Europe proper, but also lots of horses that actually added. Why? Because of those steppes raiders that always poured into the Danube Valley and laid this area's waste, and therefore didn't also allow much of a great degree of development, if not guarded. So the war areas, in my opinion, had surely maintained an important degree of warlikeness, but on patterns that were a bit different from properly the Central European ones. So that you could find lots of lighter troops that you could literally chop through with these blades, right? Because let's be honest about this, these blades are not super weapons. The blade in itself is conceived to be to cut, but it normally it's not very good for armor altogether. Anti-armor weapons are mostly traumatic ones. They surely. Am I saying that Falxes, etc., were not that good against armor? Yeah, I think so. I think that not necessarily they were conceived to properly be an anti-armor weapons, right? So I already said before that the myth that the Romans got heavier in equipment because they had to meet with this Falxes, it's basically you cannot demonstrate that, right? There is no sound evidence of that. It's to me, it's presumable that, as we will see, it was probably more missile warfare that made Romans, if anything, more careful. It's more influenced by local equipment. It also provided towards the steppes more scale armor, things like that, rather than these specific blades. Because these specific blades are good just to chop a lot of people down, right? Some of these curved blades were used also on horseback. This is somewhat overlooked. That is to say, the falx can be used properly with one hand, so you can ride a horse and fighting effectively with that as well. I don't fight double-handed double-hand weapon. No, really, that those are infantry weapons, but still, the idea that these could look as sabers, and that it's very seducing because they could be profitably used on horseback as well. So it may be that, as it happens in some other cultures, including the Celtic ones, when you have a very strong elite that develops this kind of metallurgic, it can afford certain weapons, some better equipment, etc., and focusing also in the individual training of its elements, also the collective at some level, you have the sword as a weapon that is designed properly to have an edge on the average guy that, as we've seen, is just a guy with an oval shield, no armor, javelins and spears, right? at some levels, because still also the elite would use spears that normally are, the first weapon, are they have normally an edge over swords altogether, even in single combat. And the general idea, therefore, is that, not necessarily falxes were an anti-cavalry weapon, but they may have, in I don't know, in an ambush context. Imagine, you're an angry Dacian peasant that has to run up the mountains because those, Sarmatian motherfuckers were always, raiding around, your places. Well, maybe you catch them into some wood plain and you run against them, and at close range manage to chop a horse down, to cripple it with this, curved, ferociously, merciless blade that can definitely cut into a big mammal like that. And it can be maybe some kind of, anti-cavalry weapon, but cavalry altogether in a functional sense is stopped just by a wall of spears. Right, and we don't have to underestimate, in fact, the capacities of Dacian infantry along that line, as we were saying before, not just because of the shield wall against arrows, but properly because of, a solid wall of spearmen that can bulkily oppose such enemies, especially on the tough grounds. If you see the Romanian, orographical, reality, is it's like, it's a good land for infantry in most of the time, so from tactically wise, and even more at that time, as you can imagine, was much less, hospitable than today, and yeah. So my guesses are basically these ones. Right, that there was some kind of individualism tied to having this imposant, sometimes even 1.5 double-handed swords use. Which is a political and social product of the elite. From the other side, you have also probably a lot of peasants, a lot of also relatively demilitarized peoples in the Danube Valley that is being constantly ravaged by raiders of different kind that, you can get into yourself and chopping down, because they're maybe armed literally, not even with a sword or a spear, but with a knife or something. I know it sounds a bit wargamistic as an explanation, but it's the best I can come up with. And it's also an interesting cavalry weapon, right? At least some types of it. They're not definitely majority as types of weapons, right? They're mostly a Sika can use, a bit of a longer Sika can be used like that, or even a moderately sized falx that you can use just with one hand can be an interesting horseman weapon at the same time. And for the rest, I can't find really much of another explanation. That was fun. We've seen that there were also kind of Latin derived swords there. Consider that Noricum, that was the best metallurgic center in the ancient world at the time, was occupied by the Romans, but it was just almost next door to Dacia altogether, to at least the range of reach of the Dacians properly, that were literally from the other side of the Danube. So yeah, there can be some kind of influence along this pattern. What I think is also overlooked about Dacian warfare is the presence of archery, right? Because we find, actually, the archer is the second most common type of Dacian warrior depicted in Roman sources. Simple and composite bows used properly by the Dacians and the Sarmatians, depicted in the reliefs. This is a very interesting information because, of course, as we've seen, the Sarmatians participated alongside the Dacians in their struggle against Rome. But by itself, it's obvious that the Dacians were acquainted to composite bows, which is a rarity in Central Europe altogether at this point. So the Dacians profiled themselves already a bit more exposed after the steppes military culture. And given that, that also that hypothesis that we have developed about the frontier areas between sedentary and nomadic world. And given that this is exactly what happens eventually in that area, historically, later on, etc., we can say that Dacians made an important use of archery, right? Because they could provide this bulky infantry that was, as we've seen, the anvil, essentially, whereas they had, however, still to respond to enemy archery, the steppes raiders, and surely archery was an answer in that sense. Naturally, also the Dacians were provided with any kind of skirmisher, probably was all elite types, like in any peoples actually, and also probably there was age segmentation even among the elite, for which there were kind of elite skirmishers were younger people. Relatively to the Foxes, we could have hypothesized too that such also bold enterprise of going shieldless with a two-hand sword, and also apparently unarmored against, which was not, however, the only way for sure, against an enemy, might have been a sort of initiatory right for the communities of warriors, and especially the younger elements. It's a possibility, right? This had to break in through, maybe given that, of course, in military all these armies, these arms had developed into within the same Dacian warfare. We could even think that, given the average low level, of armor, like in any of these people's armies in general, on average, such swords were designed properly to open gaps within the middle, let's say the average type of of trooper lines, right, infantry line. Just a hypothesis. It's obvious that they worked more or less like that, right? And that would have been properly more fitting to the, properly for the nature of the blades, as we've seen, rather than for an anti-armor against which they were probably damaged themselves excessively. These are narrow blades, right? So that's a bit the story, like the falchions and things. They're not properly designed to cut through armor, right? Even when they can make important damage, like even the same falchions, especially with the tip, right, of the hook. Well, yeah, but you still damage the blade consistently if you use it against like properly a helmet, things like that. So it's not a blade that is gonna be dramatically useful also for afterwards, as far as we understand. But obviously every blade deteriorates over time, so you can't say, well, in battle you didn't need that. Yeah, okay, but you have to think also about the durability and how much these weapons were properly used, or what they were designed for. So we largely lack information about that. I would say we find other things like, for example, Celtic carnics among the spoils of war of that the Romans brought from Dacia. So even there's some further Celtic influence. There really were some Celtic tribes fighting for the Dacians, for the Romans in the process. And the question that today brought us also to discuss Dacian infantry and makes it difficult to properly make a video on Dacian cavalry, because evidence is much scantier than this, is that, however, and probably Dacia didn't have also dramatic shortage of horses either, right? We can't think, I don't know, it would have been interesting and cheap to hire, mercenaries from the steppes military cultures, but the Dacian elite surely made an important use of cavalry, and we don't have to think that the fact the Romans didn't depict much of Dacian cavalry meant that there wasn't some kind of more robust consistency there. Of course, evidence doesn't hint at a dramatic equestrian capability, like the Celts altogether, like in Gaul. Also the land was different, society was different. Hint at an important amount of cavalry for sedentary standards. By the way, those weren't horse riding peoples, and frankly their cavalry was also not very good at all, like somebody would like to fantasize, especially in terms of collective training. And thus of absolute military quality. But it's in my opinion, it's seducing to think that the Dacians had a limited but very good amount of cavalry, and that this was probably influenced by the Iranian equestrian culture, and that even horse archery actually was something fairly common in Dacia itself, not just because of the surrounding peoples, but probably the Dacians themselves would have, dynamized themselves. Also, think about the raids into St. Roman Mysia and the Nubian Valley, etc. They surely had the means to raid far and wide, to have important in this open grounds where cavalry surely has a lot to play with, let's say, and that make me think, yes, that probably the Dacians had a very interesting set of troops that simply didn't also the wars against the Dacians were, after all, intense but short, right? There were basically 2 rounds in Trajan's times. There had been previous war with the Domitian, and yes, there have been these skirmishes and raiding warfare, all these things, but the Dacians are not like a century-old Roman enemy against which the Romans fought all the time. Also like the Persians or the Germans would become on a longer run after all. It's like saying, what do we know contemporarily about the Germans? Right, what do we know? Yeah, Tacitus, there are important sources describing them, right? And they tell us things that are somewhat obvious, like the ones we can hypothesize for the Dacians militarily wise, right? But it's not that we have this dramatic evidence of how, a German army operated at this time, right? There is something, but it's still fundamentally fitting that average that we can think in Central Europe was there, right? The Romans had a major conflict with the Germans as well, more than with the Dacians. So, yeah, they had been interested in the Germans. They wrote more, but also, honestly, how much do we concretely have? The same goes for, the same Gallic wars. The Romans fighting there for 8 years and describing a big deal of Gallic warfare. But if you read their and these armies were were average in the sense that nobody was interested in saying, describe what a Gallic army consisted properly of. You speak of cavalry and infantry, and we know that it was that average, and there is not much to add in the first place. So the same thing might have happened for the Dacians, right? The fact that we rely so much about the iconographic source of Trajanic monuments for their appearance, and that therefore they are mostly popularized in outlook, in that way. However, may have influenced the perception we have altogether, considering that the Romans there were depicting something which is different from describing historiographically, right? It was the celebration of great victory, and I don't know, for example, there is a lot of Roman cavalry chasing Dacians in those stripes of the Trajan column. Is that realistic? Of course it is. The Romans, especially at this time, had gained they had very good cavalry. They always had, actually. The myth that the Romans had poor cavalry is, in fact, actually very cheap. The Romans always had very good cavalry. The problem is that they had a few, right? And they preferred to rely heavily on, cheaper allies that, had much more of them readily available and employable, and they basically had a ridiculous legionary amount of cavalry for that reason. But yeah, it's not strange to say that Roman cavalry would be obviously employed also to chase fleeing enemies and things like that. The Romans probably didn't have a. You see, you're making a column that is going to exalt the emperor, the victory, etc. in the center of Rome in the forum. There is, you don't need to represent like a proud, tall, menacing Dacian noble horseman that looks like the hero of the situation, right? You wouldn't, right? In fact, we don't basically have anything similar for other peoples either in Roman iconography, nor in others, because that was the common language of how peoples would represent themselves in that way. So this doesn't mean that the Dacians didn't have anything like that. It's actually obviously obvious, right, that there was some cavalry, and even a segmented one, an elite one. It's just we lack properly the evidence of how much cavalry there was. And my take is that, considering, broadly the political, social, economical, geographical background, probably the Dacians did have a few, but it was a good one. We probably had a few good elite shock cavalry. We may even think more influenced by certain feudal military cultures, including maybe historically the Macedonian one, right? I wouldn't be surprised to see Dacian cavalry, the heavy European type, the true heavy European type that, for example, the Romans, the Germans, the Celts didn't have, which is the one with the contos, right, that the Macedonians had, that the Sarmatians had. I think the Dacians are eligible for that as well. And plus horse archers, which is also something that, even though we know existed in among the Germans, among the Gauls, among the Romans, whatever, but wasn't the primary thing. It was contained, or it wasn't particularly developed. There weren't specific units altogether operating en masse like that, like steppes people. Absolutely not. It's possible that the Dacians had something similar, because the northern Thracians had, the Sarmatians had, and it's possible that the Dacians were consistently influenced by that as well. So if you, from this, you had to reconstruct like a typical Dacian army, you would think of a very important bulk of infantry, that even in here we don't have to think just as homogeneous, but maybe segmented and even properly in multiple lines. This is maybe an overstatement, but surely there was, because there were at least, there were multiple lines even among more primitive peoples, but let's say on a regular base, maybe not so, tactically developed, because it would have been complicated properly to bring elevated numbers on the field to make operate along those. It's still possible though, right? There wouldn't be anything strange in it, but imagine it this way, right? With properly a segmentation of, probably also some bulky, like you think about some nobility fighting on foot traditionally. There was some probably bias in favor of infantry in Dacia, as we understand. Then a middle class, and maybe lighter troops, skirmishers, archers, jumping around dispersed among the ranks, whatever, and some important cavalry elite, and even some horse archer in substantial number, protecting the flanks, doing things like that. And that's a hell of a military culture. Probably with also a very good missile component properly among infantry itself, that especially in the defensive role that both strategically and tactically the Dacians often found themselves at, not entirely, but especially in their own land, it fits, and it fits pretty much. And honestly, that's something that deserves a bit more of attention, because according to me, the Dacians were not just the other, they probably had a more advanced military system than the Thracians, especially at this time the Thracians were conquered by the Romans, but even in previous times, like up to Thracia was absorbed definitively a long period of time, because it was Claudius that fundamentally secured it. So it's not very even far from Trajanic times after all. I think the Dacians had something more advanced, something more orderly, something more hierarchically organized, with some degree of more effective, let's say, higher collective training. Especially speaking about infantry, Thracians probably had better cavalry consistently, and especially larger amounts, right? And they were probably, however, similar in nature, without over, exaggerating this quality superiority, but however the Germans did. According to me, they resembled them, importantly, especially the anvil role of infantry, right? The Germans were famous compared, like the Gauls at that point would throw, as we've seen this at that point, just some peoples like the Belgians or the Helvet, they had, kind of very good infantry. The Gauls would mostly still rely on that impetus charge, but without much of an order. Instead, the Germans were more homogeneous in this kind of greater cohesion on a political and clanic base, and they would, on the field, be very orderly and careful about, advancing, retreating in order, maintaining the line, right? And according to me, the Dacians were something similar, right? So, not top military cultures, right? The neighboring Sarmatians were definitely something much more impressive altogether, but those are also nomadic peoples in a completely different context, probably by background, but still, important enough considering, also their history, their context with the civilized world, with, their level of advancement, and the fact that the Romans still seized their assets that were pretty large, as we've seen, was speaks for it. But still, they were fundamentally crushed in a relatively short time. So that's probably also the capability of a people altogether that is also limited geographically. It doesn't, bring in much, because you see around, it doesn't seem also to have been any major ethnic mass of cohesive tribes, right, to respond, right? It was mostly a frontier area, because that's the nature around the Carpathians altogether, right? Where you have in places like Gaul or Britain or Germany, you could, or Spain, you could have, let's say, varying degrees of military quality, but at least, you can kind of, identify certain regions and saying, okay, well, we are contained within these boundaries, we share something more in common, etc. When you start speaking of Eastern Europe properly, from, even the Eastern Germans were in a pretty frontier situation at that point, there are no borders anymore. It's like a mess, generally speaking. There are poorer areas, they're colder, they're less fertile, there is probably less to make a, something, functional. Well, the Dacians were at the outskirts of this world too, so they didn't share ethnically, as we've seen, probably more than much with their neighbors in a deep, visceral sense. So that's also the reason why they were taken out. Whereas, I don't know, right, with the Germans it was much more complicated, also because there were many more and scattered on a larger area, right? And so even if they didn't actually have a common identity or cohesion, broadly meant, but they still were, active enough to present a serious problem. Yeah, and so, well, okay, I guess that this is pretty much what I wanted to say about the Dacians, that, as you understand, are, I'm trying to lengthen the content to properly compensate for the lack of evidence that we have, because I don't know whether we are going to talk about the Dacians anymore, right? We will, but given that in 3 and more years we haven't talked about them yet, right? It tells you about the frequency, probably, in their broader weight. I don't know. It's obvious that we talked much more about the Celts or the Germans, right? But that's kind of obvious given the broader interactions, documentations, etc. But there is much more to say also from previous times, and at some point we will maybe cover that effectively. So for now, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.